Hello, my name's Lesley Atherton and this is my short story called Daphne Alone. Even Daphne's skirts, a heavy, sensible tweed, rusty brown, unpatterned and ending just 2 inches below her equally heavy and sensible knees, was no match for weather such as this. In common with most of her countrywomen, she resorted to an ankle-length heavy waxed coat when leaving the house, but when the wind moved from playful to aggressive like an out-of-control puppy who has little idea of its own power and strength, when the gales experimented with moving around what had previously seemed immovable, that was when the women of Daphne's acquaintance resorted to a heavy contrivance of ropes draped and tied around their bodies. For without such ropes, Jean, her neighbour of 2 miles distant, had suffered. She'd neglected to secure her clothing, just the once, and was inelegantly blown into Daphne's neighbouring field, her diaphanous coat acting as a parachute, or rather as a sail, which propelled her perilously close to the edge of the deep and rocky river bank. It was an expensive lesson to be learned, as Jean's path had led her to demolish more than one fence, and had also led to what looked to be a longish hospital stay, owing to multiple breaks, surface wounds and bruises. That was why Daphne was out in this weather. Her sheep weren't brought in for the winter. She couldn't afford such an extravagance, so she had to focus her not inadequate energies on keeping safe and intact what flock she still had. So, with the men being gone for the last 3 years, and with only the young, too old and too incapable remaining, there was nothing for it but for Daphne to mend her own fences. With hammer and nails in her coat's capacious pockets, and with a saw tied with string and slung around her back, with dinky feet encased in her husband's galoshes, padded with 3 pairs of thick socks, and with her hand-knitted woolen balaclava itching her already red and chapped face, Daphne began the trudge to the first fence repair. Behind her strong but weary frame she dragged a sledge-like contraption that she'd roughly fashioned as a means of carrying the larger of the loads that she needed to haul. She began to tug and pull, and the rope lessened the wood load which thudded heavily behind her. Not for the first time that day Daphne had wished there was no war. There was no compulsory conscription, and there was no forced separation of families. She wished that Gerald, her husband of 8 years, had been able to stay at home, and she wished he would do his bit around the farm and stop jobs such as this one from being her sole responsibility. But, as happened every time young Daphne, who was only 26, allowed her mind to raise such thoughts, she forced them away with vehemence. One must not allow one's thoughts to overtake sensibility, crying over spilt milk. No, there was no point at all allowing one's self to brood. One simply must get on with it when one felt weak or threatened. Now was such a time. Skies were darkening already with the onset of early twilight. Daphne knew how much more afraid she'd be if she was living in one of the many miserable bomb-threatened towns or cities, but still there might be some joy to be had. There might be friends for comfort during the blackouts and in the air raid shelters too. Here there was only Jean. Both women had been left alone in the most remote of sheep farming communities, and up here there were no land girls, no support. It was just Daphne and Jean. It was Daphne who had discovered Jean's battered and broken body. It appeared a corpse at first, and Daphne had been greatly relieved when Jean began to cough. Daphne had loaded Jean onto her rope-pulled sledge contraption and rushed back to the village's post office to summon the doctor, and now she was left to fix the damage. Her hands were raw and almost purple with cold and strain. By the time she arrived at the first gate, midst the hammering and sawing, Daphne allowed herself a little self-indulgence, a wandering mind. And there was so much to think of. The absence of her husband mainly, but in recent times another thought had become more prominent, the fact that the pair of them had not yet produced children. At times like this it was almost as if she had nostalgia for a life and a time that she'd never personally known. Animoia, the term was. She knew it because she'd encountered it in the village's library. She spent a lot of time there when her husband first left. Quite a few of the village ladies did the same, teaching themselves about life and the world, taking comfort in the company of others, talking of the life they now had and the life they missed. They talked of the days when their husbands received the call-up papers, and they talked of the progress of the fighting, the sounds of the telegram boys, the little evacuees who'd just appeared in the village, and the contents of their husbands' regular but stilted letters home. They talked of unravelling old sweaters to re-knit into more usable clothing, and how to cope without hosiery. There was an unplanned and unexpected small crop of barley in the corner near where Daphne was working. She would have to protect that from the sheep, but it could wait. As Daphne's self-indulgent thoughts slowed, she realised that she'd mended the fence, and that the rain, which had been sprinkling onto her waterproof layers and puddling around her feet and inside her overly capacious galoshes, the rain had stopped, and the sky had darkened. Her eyes struggled in this kind of light, but she had to get back to the farm before it darkened entirely. Her small, chapped and frozen hands replaced the spare wood onto her sledge, and she began the trudge back to her home. Thighs and calves tingled numbly with the cold, and it was just as well, as her aching and pained leg muscles needed the numbness to dull the pain. She had no watch, but she knew it was late by the time she returned home, wishing, not for the first time, that there was someone waiting. Daphne immediately made her way to the kitchen and the warmth of the range. Stoking it up once again, she began to relax a little. The casserole warming inside her oven should be almost ready. She got up and ladled herself a good portion of butter beans, potato, green onion tops and gravy browning. She ate. Nothing was ever quite enough. The house was dark and silent. No candles, no wireless. She glanced at the kitchen wall clock as she laid down her spoon after the meagre meal. 6:30. Bedtime. And tomorrow was another day.